Let's talk about narrow gamut black and white toning. To get into the narrow gamut section, we're going to need to choose a gray profile. So from the Profile Valet, select the gray modifier and then the paper by the brand name and the paper name, and then choose Apply or Download if it's not on your system. Right now I'm using a Hahnemühle Fine Art Baryta. I'm going to hit Apply, so that applies it. I have a grayscale image on the screen. Now I can go under Image to our narrow gamut black and white controls, and let's talk a little bit about these controls. First off, we have our zones, and this is where our tint pickers become active. With 0 zones, we have one tint picker, and we can tint by moving the little plus sign around inside this box. Now what narrow gamut actually means is that we're pretty close to neutral. So it's about 2 delta E around neutral, and the reason why we do this with a special gray profile is that these tones are actually technically the hardest to reproduce. What happens is if you try to print these tones using a color profile, what you'll often get is the color bouncing on either side of the tone you choose, or if you're choosing to do an absolute neutral, then your tones look a little green in some areas or a little red in some areas. I'm sure you've seen this if you've tried to print a black and white this way. So our proprietary black and white mode, what it does is it prevents this from happening. We can control the wide gamut ink set in what we call a narrow gamut mode, so that we can be very precise as we travel through the tonal range without getting any bounce, color bounce from side to side of the tone that we're trying to reproduce. And so this is what that tint picker is. And as I add zones, I get more tint pickers added, so I can then use these controls to finely tune what I'm trying to do in the tonality for the image that I'm trying to tone. I'm going to go back to 0 tones for right now. And let's talk a little bit about the DCM section down here. What DCM stands for is Dynamic Contrast Matching. And what it does is it allows us to modify the tonal curve as it passes through the tonal range from our highlights to our shadows. And right now it's off. We can choose to use it or not use it. Some people like to control the tonality themselves in an application like Photoshop, and then when they go to print they want to preserve that perfectly. They've soft-proofed with the paper profile that they're using, and it's important also to know that our gray profiles can be used to soft-proof inside Photoshop. So this is with dynamic contrast matching off, but now let's turn it on and let's look at what happens inside this image. So now we're turning it on and we have it set at the 0, mark. That would be towards an image that is sort of medium in key. So there's mostly the information in the midtones in the image. But I can also change this shape of the curve to either side dramatically, and we can see what's going to happen inside the image. So what we're doing is we're bringing out the contrast in the image to better match the dynamic range of the paper that we're printing on. What often happens when we create an image, we don't actually know what paper we're going to print it on. And so the paper being a limiting factor on how much dynamic range we can reproduce, what happens is the midtone where we've set, or anywhere in the image where we've set our contrast point and our brightness point, when that gets translated to the limited dynamic range that the paper can produce, it's wrong. And so dynamic contrast matching allows us to then fix that point. And we're using the color management system to do that, so we're not actually making a two-dimensional edit on top of the image itself. Again, I'm going to move to -1 and we can see that image kind of flatten out. Now if I move over to +1, we can see it become very contrasty. So what I want to do is find the point inside this range that puts the contrast right where we want it to be. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, and we can see it's a slight adjustment, but it's actually a proper adjustment for this image. So the image sort of flattens out a little bit with it off, and it just brings in the contrast where it's needed by turning it on and having this placed properly. And that's how dynamic contrast matching works. So now let's talk a little bit about toning. Now below the actual tint pickers, we have a grayscale here. And this grayscale will actually change so that you can see on a grayscale the effect that the tone is going to have on the image. And you can see that this represents what's actually going on in the image itself. I'm going to add another range, and now we're going to look at doing a split tone. So let's say I want to have my highlights slightly warm, not drastic, but a little bit warm. I'm going to warm those up. Let's say we're going to leave our shadows neutral for now. So that's what we have. We have a split from slightly warm highlights into neutral shadows. If I wanted to make those shadows cool, I can then move that, and now we're going to transition from that warm tone to that cooler tone, and we can see how that's reflected in the image. This is a very accurate representation of what will actually be on the print. Now if I add in another zone, I can further manipulate these points and also control where the split takes place. So I'm going to say, I'm going to put this back to near neutral, and then I'm going to go cool on my shadows, and then I want to force this so that the neutral point is more on my quarter tones, and then as I start to hit my midtones, I start to already pick up that blue tone, that slight blue tone, the coolness that I want in my shadows, and I have slightly warm highlights, and I can even tone that down a little bit. And now you can see how this image starts to take shape and what I'm actually trying to accomplish with it. And I can even add in another zone if I wanted to dial in some more specific tonalities throughout the image. And that's a good look at how we handle narrow gamut toning. And these settings can all be saved and recalled for a later date. That way, if you're building a toning book of effects that you want to keep and use over and over again, you can save these into nice little folders, and you can actually, what we say is print these images out smaller and put like maybe 9 on a page with different settings for each one, and create a nice little toning portfolio so that you can flip through and look exactly the effect you're looking for a specific image.